Hello and welcome to the podcast. Myself, Matt Davey, and Connor Godfrey. In this podcast, we're joined by Connor Southwell, Norwich FC reporter for the Pink 'Un. We talk all things Norwich City, from what went wrong last season and what they hope to get right this season as the Canaries look to win promotion back to the Premier League. Enjoy. So, Connor, kind of in between seasons now. What's the general vibe and sort of mood around Norwich City at the minute?
Yeah, it's really interesting because actually there's not been sort of any real time to dwell on relegation and probably the way it happened. Such a short turnaround between seasons, hasn't it? I think it's only been probably 2.5 weeks since they finished training for this season and they're into the new one. So there's not been much for a hangover, which again it'll be interesting to see whether that's a positive thing or a negative thing because often players after relegation get to jet off to a beach somewhere and probably forget about it all a little bit, and that probably hasn't been the case this year. So we've seen an overhaul in the squad. So I think there probably is the new season optimism creeping in now amongst supporters, and hopefully that translates to a good start on the pitch, because I think that's going to be pivotal this season for Norwich.
How would you say last season's relegation was viewed? Because does it make it easier in the fact that, I guess, without wanting to be mean, I guess Norwich is sort of a yo-yo team. They might have the odd season in the Premier League, maybe 2 seasons, back down for a season, up again. Does it make it any easier, or is it still tough to take?
I think there was probably this time around there's probably a little bit of expectation that they were going to probably go straight back down, and to be fair, all the noises that came out of the club from Daniel Farke, Stuart Webber as well, who's the sporting director, was the fact that I think immediately after promotion, in fact, Stuart Webber said that essentially what they were going to have to do was reclimb Everest again. So he was already sort of tempering expectations a little bit. Obviously, we saw with the lack of transfer activity, well, maybe not transfer activity, but certainly in terms of the fees that they sort of paid for players, we didn't really see them go out and splash the sort of money that Aston Villa did. Even Sheffield United did to an extent. They were very sort of modest with their budgets and probably a bit pragmatic. I think probably what hurts a little bit more for supporters is the manner in which they went down. 10 straight defeats, 11 in all competitions if you include the FA Cup quarter-final. There was so much hope after lockdown that it would almost be like someone had pushed a reset button and they'd be able to sort of charge their way to safety. And I think looking at the way it transpired for all those teams at the bottom, it was incredibly difficult to string a sort of run of results together. And if they'd have done that, they probably would have been okay. And their fixtures on paper, certainly at home, were favourable. So I think in many regards it was expected, but the manner in which it happened and the manner in which it derailed after football sort of resumed was extremely disappointing for supporters and incredibly tough to take. And I think from my perspective, it feels like there's probably only going to be a limit to the amount of times that they can get to the Premier League and then not stay there. It's going to have to reach a point, particularly with this new project that they're trying under Daniel Farke and Stuart Webber, where the point comes where actually they have to sustain themselves in the Premier League. Otherwise, the expectation from fans is going to be immense, I think, and that could again potentially lead to sort of a bigger crisis at the club. So this is such a big summer, I think, in terms of Norwich City's direction and in terms of what they do going forward for me. Because if they get it right and they get promoted again, then we're all sort of clapping our hands and saying brilliant, they've sort of replicated Burnley. But if it doesn't go right, then actually there's probably big questions to be asked of Daniel Farke and Stuart Webber.
So you've sort of alluded to last season, and I've got some statistics if they're not too painful.
So I've probably heard more at this point.
Yeah, no, exactly. So you finished 20th on 21 points, 5 wins, which obviously the Man City result sort of springs to mind. I mean, some of the statistics here, you can sort of see why you were relegated. 26 goals for, 75 against. 75 was the highest, 26 was the lowest, 5 clean sheets. Just sort of going, because the Manchester City win was reasonably early in the season. When that happened, did you get the impression the club was going to kick on from that? Or did you think it was just sort of a flash in the pan?
That was really difficult, that game, for a host of reasons. Equally because I think probably all Norwich City supporters and probably everyone involved with the club maybe got a little bit too excited by it. And of course, you have to remember it came off the back of them having 9-10 players out of injury. So it was so unexpected in the way it happened, and the way they did it as well was so true to what they had said in terms of how they wanted to approach the Premier League, in terms of retaining the philosophy that they built in the Championship that won them the division. And you can see that they broke Man City's press. They played some lovely football. I think the second goal that Todd Cantwell scores is built from a throw in the right back position and ends up with Todd Cantwell passing it into the back of the net. So that sort of showed everyone that actually the style of football that they wanted to play at sort of top flight level, they were capable of doing. And then everything seemed to catch up with them after that point. And again, whether that sort of result derailed them, I don't know. Maybe if they'd have lost 5-0, then actually the response against Burnley the week after would have been a bit more positive. But I don't know. It's difficult to say. It really is, because I don't think it was a fluke. Norwich probably deserved to beat Manchester City on the day, in fairness. We just didn't see consistency in their performances. And what you probably saw in reality is Norwich City face a side who wanted to play football against them and probably don't possess sort of some of the physical players that you see from other Premier League teams. I mean, Mikel Antonio is a perfect example. When he rocked up with West Ham, he just bullied Norwich City's defence. And I think subsequently they've looked at that and said, right, well, physically is that, or physicality is clearly an area that we need to improve on, and that's something they've tried to address this summer. So I think in many ways it was a perfect storm for them. In many ways it wasn't helpful, but equally I think if you offered Norwich City fans the opportunity to take that win away, I don't think they would, unless it came with survival. I think if you said you can't have the Manchester City win but you can have survival, then I think Norwich fans would have taken that. But that day, I think, in that game as a whole, was probably one that will stay with a lot of Norwich fans forever. So it's a really difficult one to answer, to be honest, in terms of what could have happened if they didn't win. But I think consistency was the main issue, really. They didn't replicate that level of performance after that game. Certainly not over a 90 minutes, over a 90-minute spell. They did in sort of spells of games. They had a good spell against Arsenal. They had a few games in December where they performed quite well, but beyond that, it was a really testing season, to be honest, and probably one that they had to take a lot of punches and sort of get back up off the canvas. And ultimately, they got relegated, but they're not, I would argue, in perhaps as bad a state as Bournemouth or Watford coming down from the Premier League. So I think there are pros and cons to it. The fact they had so much time to prepare, I think, is helpful. We've already seen 10 summer signings, for example. So I think the wheels were in motion in terms of preparation for the Championship in a long time. And it's just a shame, I think, because of the way they came up. And obviously Norwich fans are casting an eye at Sheffield United and thinking, well, that could have been how it transpired for us. But ultimately it wasn't the case. And they have to accept relegation and come back as an improved outfit, one that is probably a bit more physical, a bit more streetwise, I think, and it'll be interesting to see if that is the case, if they do well this season and return to the Premier League.
So just talking about the goals, you scored 26 goals in the league, 11 were scored by Pukki and 6 by Cantwell. No one else in the squad got more than one goal, which is kind of insane to think about. I guess my question is, how good is Pukki? Is he going to replicate? I mean, he had a very good, I think he scored 29 goals in the Championship season before, and 11, which came sort of early on in the season. He won Player of the Month, obviously. I guess my question is, how good is he? Is he going to stay? Is he going to replicate that form in the Championship? And also Cantwell, is he going to kick on as well?
I think we'll see Teemu Pukki stay at Norwich this summer. There's been some noise about a potential move to Turkey, but I don't think that's the case, certainly from what we're hearing. I think he'll probably end up as a Norwich player come the start of the Championship, which is evidently a massive boost, because ultimately, and you said the numbers there, 29 goals, Norwich can't afford to lose that from their side, particularly in a side that was so dependent on him last season. And I think the flaws in the Norwich City attack probably really got exposed when Teemu Pukki stopped scoring goals, really. And he is a good player, and he is a player that Norwich City need, and he does enable their philosophy in terms of how he links up with the attacking midfielders and how he runs in behind his movement. Equally, he does have some detractors as well, his physicality being one. I mean, we've seen him bring Jordan Hugill in. I think that's probably a counter to that. And so there's clearly a very, very good player there. I've had it suggested to me by someone in Finland who sort of watched his career from the start, really, that this is just a case of Teemu Pukki sort of ending 18 months of overperformance, really, and he's kind of gone back to his usual self, which is probably not as prolific. But the reality is, I think to expect a 29-goal season from Teemu Pukki is probably very unlikely, to be honest. I think if he ended up getting 15 goals, but the goals were sort of more shared around, then I think that's probably still a successful season for him. But that toe injury he got in December against Leicester sort of really stifled him, really. I think teams probably worked him out as well. They started defending a bit deeper against him and sort of closing off the spaces that he liked to run into. And I think that essentially teams started to nullify him. He lost a bit of confidence. And Norwich need to get him back firing again, because obviously the evidence suggests in his one season in the Championship with the club that if they can create opportunities, that he'll take them, and he's ruthless in front of goal. And everyone talks about this sort of ice he's got running through his veins, and Norwich City need that again. They need that composure and they need that experience. They can't afford to replace a 29-goal Championship striker. They'd be paying stupid amounts of money, which frankly they don't have. So they need to get Teemu Pukki fit and firing again. He's so important to their team, and for me, it's a case of whether Teemu Pukki can respond or whether this is actually the start of a bit of a regression. He's 30 now, so he's not getting any younger, and so there is that fear that actually his best days are behind him. So he has to prove that that's not the case. In terms of Todd Cantwell, he's a really interesting one. Had a really good season. His development has been a joy to witness. Obviously, you've got the whole narrative about him being a local lad. He's from half an hour up the road. Essentially, a graduate of the Norwich Academy, been with the club since he was 10. But actually, in that Championship title-winning season that we spoke about, he didn't feature a lot. And when he did feature, he got quite a bit of criticism, particularly in a game against Wigan when he essentially featured instead of Emi Buendia, who was suspended and didn't particularly have a great performance. Wasn't terrible, it was okay, but took sort of pelters on social media and had to respond to that. And then over the summer we saw him do a lot of hard work and come back a player who was more physically capable, a bit more intelligent and had a bit more confidence. And I think we saw that on the Premier League stage. He's someone who wants to take the ball in tight areas. He's agile, he's clever with the way he uses his body and draws free kicks. So many of his attributes, you would argue, are probably better suited to the Premier League than the Championship. And it's going to be really interesting to see if he does remain with the club, if he can thrive in the Championship in the same way Jack Grealish did with Aston Villa. And if he does that, then I think we could hear him mentioned in a similar sort of vein to the way Grealish is. He's certainly that type of player, but of course he hasn't done it in the Championship yet, and it is only one season. So for him, again, it's almost that carrot of trying to replicate what he did in the Premier League and proved himself at the club. Because again, even amongst Norwich fan base, there's a real split on him. Some feel he's too loud, too colourful off the pitch, and you know, in my view, that's slightly irrelevant. I think to his footballing ability, which I think is clear to all to see. But if Norwich City want to get themselves back in the Premier League, they'll be very reliant on Teemu Pukki and Todd Cantwell being confident, being on form, and producing either goals or assists for them. And that is the reality of where they are.
You sort of mentioned Emi Buendia. If I'm not mistaken, he was quite high on the list in the Premier League of chances created. Sort of just going back to the squad, you've got players like him who create a lot of chances that could maybe get a move. You've got Max Aarons, who's a promising young right back. I mean, even Jamal Lewis has been linked with Liverpool. You've got Cantwell, players like that. For you, maybe more as a fan, is it something you're looking to cash in on? I mean, do you think what they offer the squad is more than what they'd be worth to sell, I guess is the question.
It's a difficult one because the whole nature of the way Norwich City run their club, which is a bit different to other clubs in the sense that they don't have sort of a massive or a wealthy benefactor who just sort of pumps money into the club and signs off their debt. That's not the case. They have two majority shareholders who aren't blessed with great wealth really in the grand scheme, in the grand world of football. And so they have to be self-sustainable, so they have to essentially spend what they earn. And so the way their model runs is kind of reliant on the sort of exit that we saw with James Maddison, for example, where they sell a player for top money and then that goes back into either the infrastructure, the squad, the academy, whatever. So in many ways, they're quite reliant on getting a big sale in order to fund their model. That's kind of the way it works. But I think Norwich fans would be kidding themselves if they said they wouldn't be extremely disappointed if probably more than two of those players, the ones you've just referenced there, aren't at the club come the start of the season. And there's probably an acceptance around two, and that's probably Max Aarons and Emi Buendia, two who, in my view at least, have shown themselves to be Premier League quality. I think in Emi Buendia, they've got a player who could easily play for a top six club in the Premier League now. And in Max Aarons, they've got someone, a right back, who I think is going to be very desirable because of the attributes he possesses, because of his passport as well. He's English. But equally, they're in a strange market where clubs can't afford to shell out the sort of fees that they want. And so they've sort of got this dilemma of, well, do they keep hold of players in order to try and get a bigger fee next summer, perhaps? Or do they accept a slightly lesser fee now? And that's an interesting one, because, of course, then you're risking the fact that if they underperform in the Championship, then their value is going to decrease. And Norwich are going to sort of need to sell, whereas that isn't necessarily the case this summer. So it's a really interesting debate, but I don't think they need to sell any of them. Evidently their squad is better with Emi Buendia, Max Aarons, Todd Cantwell, Ben Godfrey, Jamal Lewis all in it. But I think there's a reality, and that's from within the club as well, that these players are going to be sort of sought after from Premier League clubs, and we've already seen that with Jamal Lewis and Liverpool, for example. But they have to pay the price that Norwich City want. Ultimately, Stuart Webber is really firm in the way he negotiates deals. So if they don't receive a bid that they deem acceptable, they won't be going anywhere, regardless of how much they sort of kick and scream about it. So I think Norwich fans are kind of in a nice position where they know that if they do leave, it will be because the club have had a bid that they deem to be acceptable, and one that is in the region of 20 million plus, really. Which for Norwich is groundbreaking money. So there's that side to it as well. That if they do go, they'll go for the right fee, which hasn't always been the case at Norwich. And if they don't, then obviously Norwich are blessed with probably five of the best players in the division. So I wouldn't say there's any real concern if they stay or if they do go. I think there's sort of pros and cons on both sides. But if you're a supporter, you want to see your club have the best players, right? So I think most Norwich fans will be disappointed if any of them go. But I think the reality probably suggests that at least one or two of them probably will.
Touched on Jordan Hugill. Do you think he's someone that can play alongside Pukki, or more of a direct replacement?
It's an interesting one with him, because he is really different to the side players that we've seen Norwich City recruit before, in the sense that he is someone who is in the target man mould, and now I know he does sort of a lot of work off the ball, and he fits into that box that I spoke about earlier about the physicality element of it. Norwich didn't have enough of that in either box last year. They conceded far too many set pieces and didn't score enough. He's probably a bit of an alternative to Teemu Pukki, in the sense that Pukki's very good technically, but physically probably doesn't offer what Hugill does, and Hugill probably doesn't offer technically what he did physically. But Hugill scored 13 goals in a very progressive QPR side last year, so I can kind of see why they've moved to sign him. Equally scored 13 goals in the Championship, which is very hard to sign for 2.6 million, which is the reported fee that they've paid for him. So I think it's one that makes sense. I'm not quite sure how it fits yet, to be honest, in terms of whether he is going to be ahead of Pukki, whether he's going to be behind Pukki, but it's quite a major outlay for Norwich City. It doesn't sound like much in relative football terms, but 2.6 million is a lot of money for Norwich City to buy a player for. So that to me would suggest that he's probably going to be first choice. But then does that mean Teemu Pukki is perhaps going to drop into slightly a deeper position, or again take a role in the wings a bit? I think competition is the word. They just want a bit more competition. They've signed Przemysław Poeta, which is not an easy name to say, but essentially from the Polish First Division, who's meant to be rapid and a bit more of a conventional winger, which again we haven't really seen. Norwich aren't a team who put in sort of bucket loads of crosses. They play sort of inverted wingers in Cantwell and Buendia and look to sort of exploit the space rather than sort of hit the byline and get a cross in. So again, maybe this is sort of a sign from Daniel Farke of a shift in the way they play. Perhaps they're going to be a bit more counter-attacking, but perhaps we're going to see a few more crosses in the box. Just subtle tweaks to his style of play, I think. And I wonder if that's the reason that Hugill's been brought in, to sort of offer them a bit more of something in both boxes and to give them a bit more variation as well, which they didn't have in the Premier League. And to almost fill the role that Jordan Rose had a couple of years ago, where he scored sort of 6 goals that helped Norwich sort of win some crucial points in the run into to the end of the season. So Hugo's an interesting one. I'm not quite sure where he fits yet, but in terms of fee, in terms of stature, in terms of goals scored, I don't think he'd be very happy if he comes in to be a number or a secondary striker, so to speak. So that dynamic, I think, between the front two of him and Pukki are going to be fascinating this season.
Just going on to just my sort of last question from about last season, you came up playing attractive football, and I think we all sort of expected that to carry on. I never personally expected Norwich to sort of park the bus every game, but it's something that we've seen. I mean, we interviewed Brett Ormerod, who played for Blackpool in the Premier League, and what he said was maybe trying to play their sort of attacking style of football wasn't the right thing to do. So I was just wondering, do you think that style of play should have been adapted, or they should have gone more defensive at times?
Yeah, I think with hindsight, they probably needed to be a bit more flexible in their approach. I think it probably took till December when they realised that actually they probably needed to play sort of a double pivot in midfield that sort of protected the back four. And really that's sort of too late, to be honest. So yeah, I think they probably learnt their lessons too late, and equally they probably didn't possess the options needed to change their style of play. They had too many of the same midfielders, essentially, sort of these technical midfielders that we used to having the ball in possession, rather than ones that sort of we used to, with the exception of probably Alex Tetty and Kenny McLean, that were capable of competing physically and aerially. And so there was, for me, if we're going to boil it down to sort of the major issue last season, I think it probably was the midfield. They just didn't have enough options. They weren't physically competent enough. And they kind of had a possession-based side for a team in the Premier League that couldn't keep hold of possession and didn't have the quality to keep hold of possession. So I think in fairness to Daniel Farke, to then go and try and make them into a defensively resilient team was pretty difficult to do. I think that's probably why Sheffield United had a lot more success, for example, because actually they had that base before they came up, and then it was just about building on that. Norwich City conceded a hell of a lot of goals in the season they won the title, and didn't essentially resolve their issues as they came up into the Premier League. And maybe there was a bit of naivety on their part as well, in terms of maybe thinking that they had the quality, and maybe a bit too much loyalty shown to players who did well in the Championship as well. So it's a really difficult one, but I think you have to say with hindsight, they probably didn't have the right tools in place in order to sort of change things up, which is, again, why the Hugo signing is so interesting, because I think he does offer them the variation that they certainly didn't have in the Premier League. And again, that midfield area is somewhere we've seen Ollie Skips come in from Tottenham, someone who's seen to be a bit more combative. Jakob Sorensen has come in from the Danish First Division, who is a 6 foot plus midfielder. So I think they recognise where the flaws were. But essentially, in terms of last season, I don't think they had the options to essentially park the bus, as Daniel Farke said numerous times. It was essentially this way, and that was it. So I don't really blame Daniel Farke for that, but it's probably says more about their recruitment and how wrong they got it last summer and in January, in fairness, because they essentially couldn't change their plan from August, where things were all rosy, to May, when things weren't.
So I just want to talk about Daniel Farke. Obviously, we've sort of spoken about him a little bit. So he took over in 2017, where he was coaching with Borussia Dortmund's second team. That's quite not a strange appointment, but it's not sort of a big name that you associate with promotion. I think Huddersfield did that with Jans Stewart, who was also from the same sort of background. I was just wondering, what was the feel around the club when he was appointed?
Well, they were in a bit of an identity crisis, to be honest. So Alex Neil was there before. They'd just been relegated from the Premier League again. Sort of a similar situation they find themselves. They had a lot of players that were on essentially too much money, that didn't really have a connection with the club, and it just kind of seemed like they were plodding their way to sort of obscurity, essentially, in the Championship. And so they appointed Stuart Webber and decided to sort of rip up their conventional model of having a manager who sort of oversees the footballing over operations, and a chief exec who sort of looks at the business side, to then having a sporting director and going for perhaps a bit more of a contemporary approach to it. So Stuart Webber arrived from Huddersfield, and then he decided to sort of replicate what he'd done with David Wagner, and again, probably replicate is it looks like a carbon copy, moving from a club and then appointing from the club that you appointed your other successful manager from. I don't think that was the case. I think he essentially drew up a short list at Huddersfield of managers who he wanted to replace Wagner. I think Daniel Farke was on that list. He'd certainly been in contact with Farke prior to his appointment at Norwich. I think it was excitement, to be honest, because, as I said, there wasn't a lot to be optimistic about at that point. Norwich were in a bit of a rut. They had all these young players that they didn't really know what to do with. They didn't have a plan. They hadn't really got any players developing from the academy. They had plenty of players who they'd signed for big money in the Premier League that hadn't performed, Stephen Naismith being a good example of that. And they just needed a reset. And I think Webber and Farke brought in a host of new names from sort of the lower divisions, cut the wage bill, and that first year was really transitional. It was Daniel Farke essentially trying to build his philosophy and Norwich City trying to change their culture. So there was probably a little bit of patience that was needed, and I think in fairness to the supporters, they showed that. But he wasn't an appointment that... I think it was an intriguing appointment, perhaps rather than an exciting one, but obviously the season after, you could kind of see from the season before with hindsight what he had built and what he was trying to do in that first year, because it all came to fruition, obviously. But I think he's in a really difficult, interesting time at the moment, because we've seen him rebuild the club, implement a philosophy, put his tactical ideas across, and then for his tactical ideas to constantly get battered in the Premier League. So now he comes back into the Championship. Are we going to see a reinvention? Are we going to see subtle tweaks? I think fundamentally it will be Norwich City will try and retain possession, but I think there'll be subtle tweaks within that, which we haven't really seen from a Daniel Farke side before. And if they don't start well, for example, then I think it's going to be really difficult to see how he remains in a job, given the way Norwich City ended last season. And he's loved in Norwich City. He's adored. The fans really like him, but I think there was, and they gave him the benefit of the doubt in the Premier League as well, in terms of didn't have a lot of money to spend, wasn't given a particularly, or wasn't dealt a fair hand in terms of the injuries. They had essentially 3 centre-backs out every week. And so they gave him the benefit of the doubt for that. I think if they don't now come into the Championship and they don't come out of the blocks with fully fit centre-halves and plenty of money and plenty of overhauls to the squad, then there will be questions asked. And this is the interesting thing about next season for Norwich City, is the fact they have expectation. Daniel Farke's not used to having expectation at Norwich City. Stuart Webber's not used to having expectation at Norwich City. So to see how they both respond to that is going to be really interesting. But his journey in particular at Norwich has been interesting. It's kind of set back a little bit now, and he's got to prove himself again in the Championship, and he's got to prove himself capable of putting together a squad capable of challenging, because if he doesn't, then I think, as I said before, there's going to be some serious questions asked of him.
Do you still have the faith in him as fans? Do you think he's the right man to take the club forward, or do you sort of think he's done what he can by converting, like you say, our Alex Neil squad, and he's successfully turned it into an attractive footballing side who've sort of had a season in the Premier League? Does it worry you slightly that that's just his ceiling, that's his limit, and he sort of reached that?
I think there's an element of that naturally. I think we've seen Norwich, and I think the supporters are still with him. In fairness, like I said, I think the relationship has been dented a little bit because of obviously the 10 straight defeats. I don't think any supporter ever wants to see that as a club record for Norwich City, for example. But there was never a major call for him to be sacked or anything like that. Because of what he did in the Championship and how unexpected that was from where they were. So I don't think that it's a surprise that he's still Norwich City manager or head coach. And yeah, I think there is a concern that maybe there was a little bit of luck, and that Championship title winning season was just everything coming together, the stars aligning, and he's got proof that's not the case. He's certainly been given a wealth of options by Daniel Farke, by Stuart Webber rather, this season to try and implement a Championship promotion winning squad, essentially. And again, that expectation is going to be interesting to see how he manages that, because that's something he's not had before. In his first season at Norwich City, supporters were told it was a transition. The second year was kind of this is still part of a long-term plan. And then the Premier League was kind of, we've got to reclimb Everest again. So those expectations have always been tempered. There's no way of doing that this year. There's nowhere to hide for him, essentially. And if he doesn't get it right, then I think we could see Norwich make a change pretty quickly. But I don't think we'll see supporters turn, because they feel indebted to him after what he's done since he arrived at the club, because it was in such a bad place when he arrived. And for me, it's interesting that they've opted to go in a different approach to Watford and Bournemouth, who have decided to change their head coach. Norwich have decided to keep their head coach and change the squad. So again, obviously come May, we'll see who's had the most successful approach. But Norwich City and Daniel Farke will certainly be hoping it's them.
I just want to ask quickly about, so we've not got long left, the whole Delia Smith ownership. It's a tricky one, because I think in the world of football now, I mean, we're Southampton supporters, so we're owned by quite a rich billionaire, I suppose, and we're co-owned by a billionaire as well. Perhaps the money isn't flowing into the club as we would like. I guess the question is, for maybe you as a fan as much as anything, is that ownership, has that reached its limit, and are fans tired of, constantly yo-yo up and down the leagues? Are they just now at a point where they just want someone to come in and properly splash the money so they can compete?
It's a really difficult question to answer. I think there's always, as any football fan, you always want to see your club play at the highest level, and you want to see them buy players for 30 million, and that's part of being a fan, right? But equally, I think Norwich fans are quite appreciative of what they are in terms of their ethic and in terms of their values. They are still, and probably one of the last remaining community clubs in the organic sense of the word. They are owned by supporters. They aren't conventional in the way they run the club, and of course there is some frustration, and I think there's probably an argument to say that you can't be a self-sustainable club in the Premier League, and I certainly think if they get promoted again and come down again, then I think the scrutiny will turn onto the boardroom and the ownership in particular, because ultimately they can't just keep yo-yoing between the divisions. And this is why they've gone to this sort of model again with the sporting director. The idea is essentially that there's less onus on spending money and more about developing and coaching players. And that's why you have a head coach. So, which we've seen with the 5 academy graduates. But equally, if they come up again and they don't stay up and they don't spend a lot of money, then there are going to be supporters who wonder, well, this clearly does not work. This is not a model that works in contemporary football. And there is going to be some frustration towards that. And there is going to be some animosity towards that. The difficulty is the fact that Delia Smith and Michael Wooden-Jones have been owners for 20 years. They have always said they're open to investment. And the reality is no one credible has come forward and offered an alternative. And until that's the case, then realistically, the supporters have even got a choice of being a self-sustainable football club or not being a club at all. And of course, everyone's appreciative of what they did in terms of saving the club back in the late 90s. But yeah, there is an acceptance that modern football has moved on, and there might have to be a time where they do look to see if there's external investment that they can get in the club. But that has to be right, I think, and that has to be the right person, because as you guys know, being Southampton fans, to get that wrong can be so catastrophic for any football club. So there's almost a cautious element to it, I think, as well, a be careful what you wish for element. Yes, we've got the Wolves and we've got the Leicesters who have been successful, but equally we've got the Charltons and we've got the Berries and we've got the Boltons, and there are so many more examples, I think, of it going wrong. And Norwich are a very safe football club, even with the current situation that's going on now. They aren't in massive sort of financial difficulty. But again, they are a club essentially funded on player sales, and there is always going to be an element of that is despised by supporters, because they want to see progression, they want to see them keep their best players, and there has to come a point where they try and sustain themselves in the Premier League, and then they try and keep hold of their best players. But that can only come if they're in the top flight. If they're in the Championship or they're yo-yoing between the divisions, then they're always going to be in the cycle where they produce players and then have to sell them for a lot of money. So I think there's probably a bigger debate about the ownership issue to come. But I think right now the task is purely on getting the club back to the Premier League and supporters being fully focused on that. But I think I can certainly see in the distance, not a crisis, I think that's probably a bit much, but certainly a frank discussion about the direction of the club. If it doesn't go in the way that Norwich City fans hope it goes. And if it does reach that point, it's going to be very interesting to see what the outcome is, given that Norwich City are realistically, geographically, not in the best position or not in the most attractive position for, let's say, a billionaire to come invest, for example. So it's a really interesting one. One I think will rumble on. But there's certainly no anger towards Delia Smith and Michael.
How realistic is it that we can see Norwich in the Premier League again in, say, a year's time?
I would say, as we sit here right now, recording this with they've got the crown jewels, I think, as they've been described, the 5 players. If they can retain 3 of those, any 3 really, then I think you have to put them as favourites for the division, really. And the expectation from supporters is probably a top 6 finish minimum. And they would probably say that if they don't finish in the top 2, then they'll be bitterly disappointed. So the expectation's there. For me, the squad is there. It's all going to be about how it works in practice. I mean, they've got such a bloated squad at the moment, so they need to get some players out the door. That's going to be key as well. That's how they shift those, and the dynamic of the squad is going to be interesting. How Daniel Farke decides to sort of tweak his philosophy and his style of play again is going to be interesting. So there's many moving parts, but if they get it all right, there's absolutely no reason why this time next year they can't be preparing or at the beginning of another Premier League season. And there's no reason why they can't replicate what Burnley have done, for example. But they need to do it, and the Championship doesn't really care for ego or for who you are or how much you've spent or the quality of squad you've got. When you're rocking up at Rotherham away, you know that you've got to compete and you've got to fight and you've got to show the desire. And if they've got that in their squad and they're hungry, then there's absolutely no reason why they can't do it again and why they can't come back again. And again, as we've alluded to, the bigger questions are then when they return and how they approach it. But I think they'll be back, and I think they'll be back fairly soon. But whether or not it's next season or not, we shall see.